Okay, yeah, so I'm Evan. I'm working at No-Red Inc., and we've got about, I heard almost 50,000 lines of Elm code there, and looking for more people to work on it. So it's rare that I get to talk to an audience where everyone knows about Elm already. So I wanted to take a chance to sort of talk about some community stuff that isn't ever really appropriate in other places. So I wanted to focus on two main questions. One is, what does collaboration look like in this community? And two, what's next for Elm? So we'll show some stuff that's going on. And we'll sort of come back to this idea of code is the easy part. Again and again, we'll see, writing code's important, but there's all this other stuff that goes into it. And I want to start with the best advice I've ever gotten for working on this language. So when I started at Elm, I'm just working on my own. It's nice. Things are going well. And sort of in the periphery, there are these other projects that I know about, sort of languages that are like Haskell, compiling to JavaScript, and more of them come into being. And at some point, Ohm comes out, and they're doing this virtual DOM rendering, and it's really quick, and it's actually faster than React. And I'm like, oh, there's some competition out here. There's some other people using the same kind of techniques. PureScript comes out, and so I'm feeling kind of like, oh, geez, can I do it faster? How can I be better? And there's all these pressures of, we need this feature, or I think this is the most important, but this person thinks this other thing's the most important. How about we do them at the same time? It gets kind of crazy. So I had a chance to talk with Guido, who made Python, and he gave me this advice. Just do a good job. Now, in some ways, this advice is too vague to be helpful, okay? But what he was saying is, I was working on Python, and when I started that in 1990, Perl already existed and was pretty popular. And after that, we got Lua and we got Ruby, sort of inspired by, closely related to Python. And we have other projects like PHP, Java, JavaScript to some extent that are all kind of filling a similar niche. And if you look at them as technical artifacts, they're pretty similar. So not only do they all exist, but all these communities flourished. So each of these communities was growing in the same time period and became something unique and interesting with its own community. So what he's saying when he said, just do a good job is, ultimately you can't control what's going to happen out here, but you can make sure you're building something that people find delightful, that's fun, that's a great community, and that's what you should be focusing on. So one of the bigger takeaways here is that alternatives make each community stronger. Right? So if you imagine that the Python and Ruby communities, one of those languages stopped existing and they had to come and become one community. I don't know if everyone would get along well, right? People have a different philosophy about how code should work, what is beautiful code, what's an approach to writing code, what should a library look like, and that we have two separate places for that means that people can sort of find their way to a community that matches how they feel and what they want to do. So when you get this cultural sorting effect, and we see that in Elm as well. So if you go back a year or so on the mailing list, you'll see a lot of people talking about type classes. When are we going to have this in Elm? We need this. It's the most important thing. And a language came out that had different priorities, and all the people who wanted that kind of feature start using this language. And so now, that's not to say one community is making a better choice than the other. It just means we can all experiment with a different philosophy and way of thinking and do well. Another neat thing about this is that we're all learning from each other, right? So when I saw the tricks they were doing, I was like, oh, we can use, we already had this single source of truth, pure view functions. We can use this for HTML. I didn't realize that. And then, over the course of some amount of time, we can optimize it and make it really fast. And so when stuff like Redux comes out, again, this is another way where we can learn from each other, where these communities build upon each other and people can find their way to something that works best for their project or their perspective. So thinking about it in this way kind of lets us find some kind of interesting patterns. So one of the things I notice as I look at other languages is there's a kind of different kinds of organizational structure. I was talking to someone yesterday who didn't realize, they were like, can you make money on a programming language? And the answer is kind of just no. Like it's been done with like MATLAB. It's like there are examples, but it's really, really rare. So usually a programming language sort of lives in some other institution. And so one of those is a top tech firm. So it's not, it's not just a big building. It's decorated with sacks of money, okay? And so the languages you see coming out are things like Java or JavaScript or Swift or Go or Rust. These are all coming out of these top tech firms. And when you look at them in this way, you start to see some patterns. So like if you think about what are the goals generally of these languages, often it's support a platform. So like with Java, it's not necessarily like we want to make the most amazing language. It's like we're Sun and we want to sell some servers, so it'd be good if people had an easy time writing servers. And with JavaScript, it's not we want to make the best language. It's like, well, we really want this browser thing to work out because I like that people are searching on Google and they're going to Amazon and they spend time on Facebook. And so on some level, it's just we want this platform to be nice. Same with Swift. We want people to make iOS apps and stuff. You can also notice some things about core teams. So in all of these things, we have larger teams. I think 6 is a low-end estimate, but that's sort of the bottom edge of things. So yeah, so if you think about JavaScript, that's sort of an extreme case, because Chrome team, I believe, is 60 people. They're not all working on JavaScript VM, but let's say 5 of them are. And then there's a team at Microsoft and Apple and Mozilla. This adds up. So another home for programming languages is universities or research institutes. So this is languages like Haskell, Camel, and Scala. And in these, the goals are more research and explore. It's, there's no, it matters the details, right? And it's not, we want to make your day-to-day better. It's, we have this idea that might make day-to-day better, and we want to explore that to see if it pans out. And these are smaller teams, usually 2 to 4. Haskell, I know a lot of the work on the popular compilers, mainly that size team. Relatively stable group of people. Okay, so the last one is startup. So examples of languages that live in sort of smaller companies are Python, Ruby, and Elm. So these don't have the sort of big name. It's Google, Python. You don't get that kind of branding boost, which actually, that's a big help. Marketing's hard if you just piggyback on Apple's marketing. That'll help you out. But so the goals here tend to be, we want a nicer way to do X, right? The platform already exists. So with Python and Ruby, it's maybe we're writing servers, but we want to do it in a nicer way. Or we're writing scientific computing code, but we want it to be nicer. Or we have all the C, but we want to script it in this nice way. And it's the same with Elm. We have this platform, and we want to do it in a nicer way. And yeah, the core team tends to be BDFL based. This stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. It's kind of a Python community term. But the point I'm trying to make is it tends to be there's a core contributor that's sort of related to the project for the course of its life. And so once you sort of have this way of categorizing the home of a language, you can start to ask some questions in a more sophisticated way. So some people might say to me, why there should be more people working on Elm full time. Like, why aren't there more? When are there going to be more? And you can refine this to, are bigger teams better, right? We actually can look at all these different projects and see, what would you get for more engineers, if you threw millions of dollars at the problem. And so my personal view is that they're not really. So I have 2 examples. One is our error messages. So this is a problem that's existed in sort of typed functional languages for decades. And you have these research institutions and papers written over years and years. And they're not matching the quality that we get. So had we had that resource, would we have gotten a better result? It didn't seem necessary. This is also a new error message that'll be coming out in the next release. It now recognizes if you have a missing argument, or you need an extra argument. And also fast rendering. So this is another thing where I redid the virtual DOM renderer with 17. So if you're using 17, it's very fast. Congratulations. And so I finally got these benchmarks out to see how fast it was compared to other sort of rendering systems. And we do really well. And so this is up against teams that have 6 people or more, and who aren't making a language necessarily. Like they don't have to worry like, oh, what's the package ecosystem like? Like they just don't work on NPM, you know. So again, is more people really getting you a lot? Another thing you can think about when you're looking at things this way is the development timeline. So I read this quote, or I read this on one of the mailing lists a while ago. Basically, 13 years ago, we started using Lua because it was stable, you know, the ecosystem was nice, people were using it in production, and it feels hard to make that case right now for Elm. And so the root here is like, I think Elm is cool and I want to use it. But it's making a weird sort of association, right? So it's saying, okay, I'm comparing Lua versus Elm. And 13 years ago, Lua was ready to use. And 13 years have passed. What's Elm been doing the whole time? Just sitting around? It's sort of the suggestion here. So the trick is that Lua came out in 1993. So the root of this is saying Lua, after 10 years, is more mature than Elm after 4 years. Which is true, and like that, it's easy to think this way when you're thinking about different program languages. Say, well, this is what's going on in this community. We should have that as well in this other community. It's like, well, it's not as simple as just doing the work. Some of these things sort of develop over time in a somewhat predictable way. So if we look at sort of different timelines of languages, we can think of Python. So it was released in 1990. And the orange dot, that's today, 26 years later. And we can look at the timeline for Elm. 2012 initial release, today, 4 years later. Now notice it's aligned on release, not on the present, right? And when you think of things in this way, you can start to do all sorts of stuff. So maybe what are landmark things that happen? But what I wanted to take from this was, what does the community look like over time? So I got to get coffee and ask about some of these details. One of the things I learned was in 1995, 5 years in, Guido's still primary contributor. So that means people, you know, GitHub didn't exist then. So people might mail him a patch through email and he would merge it in by hand if he thought it was nice. But sort of the culture around that was very different. There was no expectation like, I do a PR, we get a quick response. And there was no like, oh, is this team big enough? It's like, well, it's Python in 1995. I don't know how big, like, it's not Python today, right? Another interesting thing was in 2000, they introduced the Python enhancement proposal. So this is sort of a community-driven way to suggest changes to the language, get feedback in a structured way. Now, I think, you know, you could move this earlier, but I think it would be a mistake in the sense that 10 years is enough time to sort of figure out what is this language really about, what is its character, and not only does the creator know that, but a large community of people understand that such that you can say, okay, what is the future of this language? And people sort of have an intuition of what would be true to that project. So it's sort of, once you start thinking this way, you can sort of see there is a natural progression of communities and languages over time. Now, I wanted to come to this chart also because it's quite evocative, right? We've got 20 years of unknown, okay? So the rest of the talk is like, what goes in there? So finally, we get to what does collaboration look like? And so the core of it is socializing and using Elm, right? So a lot of people think, if I want to be a part of this project, it means writing code, getting that code merged. If the code doesn't get merged, it's a failure. And I think that's sort of an unhealthy way to approach an open source project in general. But in this particular community, I think these are sort of the core parts. And often you want to be just cycling back and forth. So what socialize, what I mean is, there are all these places where people are talking about Elm, using it, or talking about questions they have, what they've done, thinking about ideas. And so you can go and check out like, what are people up to? Maybe you'll find something inspiring. Maybe you'll see something that you can learn, right? So you see someone do something you've never done before. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's a bad idea. But you start to get that kind of exploration. What problems come up? Do you see questions again and again? Are there things you can do to help? Maybe that's just working with someone individually. And so we're not writing code here, but we're sort of building the fabric of a community. We're having those relationships and learning things together. There's also using Elm. This one's more self-explanatory. But one way to approach this is like, is there something from JavaScript that you made that you want to try out in Elm? Or is there some project you're excited about that you want to see what it'll look like? Or is there something in particular you want to learn, and can you build a project around that? So I've definitely done that before, where I wanted to learn a language, and my key is like, okay, I'm definitely confused about this concept, so my whole project's going to be centered around that, so I have to confront it. And so once you have this loop, you end up getting a lot out of it, right? So maybe you say, hey, I'm working on this neat thing. Someone gives you a nice idea. You can work on that. You get feedback. Or you see someone's confused. You write a blog post or example about it. And you start to get these really nice sort of interactions and sort of experiences that build a community. Now, as you're going through this, at some point, you might get inspired. It might happen. And so one example of this is Laszlo Pandy with time travel. So he'd been using Elm, we would always talk about design stuff. He has a great design sense. And at some point, he sort of by chance saw this Hacker News comment that was like, oh, this Elm thing seems nice, but like, what's the debugging situation? If the debugger is bad, it's worthless. Like, it's all garbage and no one should ever consider it. And one way to respond to that is to say, well, you know, there's this type system and it's really nice and all this. But another way to respond is to say, yeah, historically functional languages don't have good debuggers. And what if we addressed that concretely? So he took that full on. So what happened is, you know, by chance he saw this thing. He got passionate about that. And he happened to have the skill to sort of make it all work out. And when these three things align, like projects can come from that. Oh yeah, so I wanted to show, for people who don't know, it's kind of like an old thing now. But this was like one of the early demos of this thing. So you can have the thing play. And this, like, to do this in a way that was reliable, no one had done that before. So that was pretty neat. Another example is Elm WebGL. So this is John, who, again, he had been really active on Elm Discuss, always chipping in discussions with sort of insightful comments, interesting information that added to things, and meanwhile using Elm for stuff he was interested in, so making a tank game, lots of games. And on the side of that, sort of thinking about how can I make this world building in 3D. And so that sort of came together. And he was like, you know what, I bet I can do this in Elm. And so started working on an API. We end up sort of going through it together. It ends up getting some parts merged into the compiler, quite a cool library. So yeah, so notice there's no like line from this first part, socializing using Elm, to being inspired. Okay, I've represented the source of inspiration as a rainbow and a rabbit in a hat. Something happens. There's no recipe here as far as I know, or at least that's a different talk. And so once you're inspired, it's time to work. And so that means a particular thing, right? So a lot of times it's like, when do we merge the code? I got this code, when do we merge it in? And I think this is a weird way to think about it. And in particular, I tend to batch work. So this is just something to know about the projects that I work on. So typically, maybe someone will open an issue, and then there's some resolution, and then some more issues open, and there's some other resolutions, and this process keeps happening. And I think for a lot of people, they think of this is the ideal way. You know, we have 0 issues open, we're responding to everything promptly. Great. Okay, so I don't do it this way. So you know, we might get an issue, and then we might get some more issues, and then like the next week there might be some more issues, and then like some more. At this point, like people are like, freaking out. People are crying in the streets. They're displaced from their homes by floods, like the locusts have come. But this approach is really nice from the perspective of once we're at this point, we can actually look at all those issues and start to see some trends, right? So maybe we can say, actually, these people over here are all talking about a similar thing. They sort of have slightly different goals. They have different ideas of how to achieve that. But fundamentally, there might be a solution that addresses all those concerns. So when you do that analysis and design in a conscious way, you can say, okay, I'm going to have this solution over here. It's going to address most concerns. And this other solution over here is going to address these other concerns. And then everything else are sorted by these two things. Now, the time to closing the issue was longer, but the end result, I think, is a much simpler result, a much simpler thing. And so this is another thing to come back to, like, what does team size get you? Well, it makes it easier to use the first technique. And a lot of times people don't realize the process they have is influencing the API decisions, the design decisions they're making. So this is one way so for a lot of Elm projects, I think it's good to sort of hop around and let things sit such that when you come back, you can make a coherent set of design decisions that become a coherent release that makes an easier upgrade. People understand what are the goals, what things are new, and it's not this sort of piecemeal. Now, another thing to think about is we're making a platform, right? So if I change core, if I have a major release of the core libraries every month, that's a bad idea, right? Like, that's going to mean every single library in the whole ecosystem is going to have to be like, okay, we have to make this little change here and there. So from that perspective, it's actually really nice to batch work as well. So you can say, okay, here's this coherent set of changes. A lot of things are nicer now. The upgrade costs are low. So this is weird, but this is how I do it. Now, because it's weird, we got this guy called ProcessBot now. And so he'll show up on issues that people open and just sort of explain what's up, right? Like, here's what it means to do a really nice issue. Here's what to expect going forward. This is how things are going to work. I really like ProcessBot, but maybe I just really like Bender. I don't know. Okay, so that is a weird way to approach things. But what is like a way that sort of empirically tends to work out? So one is say hi on Elm Dev, right? Hi, this is my name. I'm looking to do these kind of things and get some feedback. Maybe someone's worked on a project like this before. Maybe a lot of people have, and there's a bunch of information people can point you to. Maybe no one's ever worked on the project before because no one ever thought of it, or because people thought about it and then they were like, this is a terrible idea. And so getting that feedback early on in the process means you can be much more directed, and it also means people can coordinate around what you're up to, right? Just knowing that these projects are in flight means that you can sort of plan other things in the community to make things go smoother. From there, you want to be designing and drafting. So like, what solutions exist, and then which one's the simplest. So when you first start it, this might be literature review. What are all the solutions to this that have ever been thought of in any language? Which one seems promising? Okay, what are all the APIs I could have that expose this functionality? Which one seems promising? And sort of keep doing this exploration and then trying to find a simple thing. And then from there, just get feedback. So this is something that you see again and again in sort of cool contributions. So Elm WebGL, Elm CSS was this way. This was an early library that Richard was working on, sort of still learning how do I model my data in a cool way? What's a nice API for this? Elm test is this way. Elm autocomplete's this way. Elm style animation, which we'll hear more about today. And from here, you just want to like cycle between these two things. Try something out. Try to make it simple. See what people think. See if they can think of ways to make it better. And then repeat this process. And you'll slowly improve, learn. And I think this is sort of what it looks like to collaborate on things. And so it's not about the code, right? Code is written here, but that's the easy piece of it, right? It's, I can write code that solves the problem, but that's sort of missing the point. Like, there are always lots of solutions, but what's a good one? What's one that people have tried out and they like? What's one that people think is simple and fun? So some examples of this are Elm format. So this is, again, Aaron. I think we met at Elm meetup in San Francisco. And so we would talk there. He was using Elm for stuff. And at some point, he was sort of inspired to try to work on some core tools and wanted to learn, hey, I'm interested in learning Haskell better. I'm interested in thinking about parsers. So I think this Elm format project would be good. And so that's it's too late, I apologize. But there's this page of Elmling projects that's sort of a list of, here are some projects that seem relatively separate. They don't need a ton of coordination that would be cool for the community. And I try to keep it updated, but sometimes it runs thin because people draw from it. So Elm format was this way. And then when it came to doing the work, it was, how do we keep these parsers in sync? How can I make this fast? I have this performance bug. You know a bunch more about Haskell. Maybe there's some clue here. So always about sort of getting feedback and collaborating. Elm test is a similar way. Richard definitely is in this socialize use Elm loop in an extreme way. And at some point, when you're writing tons and tons of lines of Elm for work, you're like, well, the testing isn't as nice as I want it to be. And if you're coming from Ruby or something like that, you're like, well, I know what really nice testing is like. And so he took that, instead of saying like, shucks, that's a shame, was like, you know what, I have the background skills and the motivation to make this happen. And so not only can we have something that's nicer, I think we can have the best thing. So I'm really excited about what's going to be happening with Elm test. But yeah, so that's sort of the shape of collaboration. So now, so I wanted to mention what's coming next. So we sort of know the last couple of releases about error messages, about subscriptions, and then it's like that's the end of history. And unless you're following Elm Dev, I do status reports. It's like, it's just mystery and a forest of unknown past that. So I wanted to give some insight, not only into what's coming next, but sort of what the process is to figuring that out as we go forward for years and years and years. So 18, I expect, will be a debugger. So I wanted to show a little bit of that. So remember Laszlo 2013 doing time travel. In that time, we've sort of learned what makes things more useful or less useful. So what we have here is this is normal Elm reactor. But I have a development build that it will just compile things in sort of debug mode. So it's using Elm make with a -- debug, the debug flag. And it just adds this little thing in the corner. I don't know, it's kind of small. But so I can say, invent the universe, bacon apple pie. I think that's the order. And notice there's this little number that's been increasing here. So if I click on this thing, I see a debug pane. And over here I have the model of the whole application. And over here I have the whole history of messages. So I can see everything that's happened and sort of run through that. So I'm just pressing the arrow keys now. So if I resume,
can you make it bigger?
I can try. In that this is early, you never know how that's going to go. I don't know if I can make the side pane bigger, actually. Just pretend you can see it, okay? That's the best I can do. So one thing we can get an idea for here is if I check this, you can sort of see in the model it changing from true to false. I hope you can at least see it changing a little bit. And I can select all and see them all change. And I can edit this guy, invent the multiverse. I don't know. This is a crazy pie now. But you see it changing in the particular entry. So this is pretty neat, right? So you can sort of introspect, and as you navigate through, you can see going back. Now, that's nice. I think from a learning perspective, this is really cool, right? So we haven't looked at the code for this at all, but we kind of have an idea of how it's working. We know what the data looks like. We know what it looks like when you do certain things, and we see the messages. But what's really neat is we have this little import-export feature. So if I say export, I'm going to save this history of messages, and then I can go to Firefox. And again, I'm in the same reactor. And here's the same thing, hello. Now here I can say import, and I want that history. And I've got it all here, right? So I can go back in time. Yeah, so this is pretty neat. I'm excited for this. So the use case I have in mind is you have someone who's working QA and they do this crazy sequence of events and they're like, okay, if you do all this, then this UI element's 2 pixels off, all right? And so you get this report, it's like, I did this thing, it was in Internet Explorer, whatever, probably any of that, I don't know. And I ended up with this problem. Instead of that, they just export it, send it to you, and they're like, look, right? So we'll see what else can come from this. I think a lot of cool things, but I think having this sort of replayability is going to be really nice for debugging. Yeah, so there's more we can do. So this is sort of an early draft still, but you know, let's talk about that. So upcoming work. One thing is work on code swapping. So what we saw was just this import-export. But to get it really, that's just a flag on the compiler. So if you're embedding things or doing things full screen, you can get that little debug pane and track things in this way. But if we get it integrated with Reactor, we can say, okay, someone saves code. We can push that over and save the history, load the new code, load that history, and sort of be back. So that UI element that's 2 pixels off, you can change your code, save, and then be like, okay, it's fixed now, bug closed. So that'll be sort of immediate. Yeah, so server-side rendering, I've done some work on that. It seems straightforward, but I don't trust what it looks like. I don't know. It seems fine. I don't know. But I think that one will be cool. We'll see what happens. And past that, it's the next thing sort of planned is improving packaging. So there's a lot of things along these lines. So one is, can we make it so you can cache stuff more easily if you have CI builds, or maybe you have a lot of proprietary code and you want that to be packages that's documented and people can search that just as easily as they can with public ones. There's sort of these more extreme needs. And so I think there's a lot that can be done there. It's sort of vague at this moment. It's just like, that needs some work. And with the batching technique, you know, you go and look at what everyone wanted and sort of try to bring that together. So after that, it's question mark, question mark, question mark. And so I wanted to sort of say, how will that get filled in? So there are a lot of sort of topics that are ambiently interesting and important. And what pops out of them is sort of based on what the community needs, what seems inspiring or interesting. So one of them is platforms. People are like, I want Elm on my server. I want Elm on my phones. What about WebAssembly? That one is kind of a long-term thing, right? So you think from beginning of Elm to now, that's 4 years, and it's like pretty good for front-end stuff. To think that we're going to be like a month and it's running on servers and it's a great experience, I think is a little crazy. But there are ideas that sort of set us up for thinking about these things that will pop up into this next slot. So part of working on packaging is sort of learning more about different kinds of concurrency that could be interesting for our process library. So this sort of building in that sort of long-term idea into short-term projects. Another one is tooling. This section's a little thin now, but that's because it's like debuggers happening. A big entry from there has moved up. But one thing we can think about is doing type suggestions, right? So if your cursor's at a certain point, we can sort of say, okay, I think the type here is going to be this, and we have these function and values that can fit there. So here are some things you might want to add. Another one is sort of making a fancier REPL. So we have this way of navigating to particular messages in our history, what if at that particular frame you could say, actually, I want to take this model and mess with it a little bit and use this function. And so you can get these kind of much more intense, cool debugging experiences. Maybe that's a terrible idea. I don't know. And then there's a bunch of miscellaneous stuff that sort of pops in and out. So one is like documentation. People are interested, how do we write single-page apps? I can work on that, maybe write some documentation or make some sort of example, and that will sort of pop into the process of what gets worked on. Another example is like the HTTP library should probably be in core. That'd be good, but that's probably going to coincide with a big change to core, so it wants to be a major release. That's a good time to do a bunch of stuff on the HTTP library that would make it nicer because you're doing this big change anyway. And like there are a bunch of fixes where it's like, well, this API in core could be a little bit nicer, but it's going to require a major bump. So it's not to say that's not important, but it's just like that needs to fit into a broader thing. So if there's, for example, this debugger is going to need a major change to core, that's actually a great time to do a lot of these fix-up issues because we're going to need it anyway. So yeah, so that's sort of how to think about what's coming next. So this finally brings us to the title of the talk. Code is the easy part, right? So in all these things, it wasn't about the sort of technical artifact. When it comes to thinking about communities, it's about how do these, not what's the technical artifact that people use, but what do we use it for? What is our relationship with each other? What's fun and interesting? When it comes to collaboration, it's not, I wrote this code, it's, I got feedback, I had this idea, I learned this thing, and sort of synthesizing all of that. And when it comes to what's coming next for Elm, it's not, this code just needs to be just written. It's like, what's a way, oh wow, I'm ahead of schedule. What's a way we can, sorry, it threw me. Work on something that's not just an improvement, but something that maybe hasn't been done in programming languages before. So people see and say, oh, wow, like that's going to help me out. Or something that for me, I'm just like, this is really cool. I'm excited to share it. That's often a really good sign that like you're working on something that's going to be cool. So yeah, so the big thing here is it's not about a technical artifact. And it's easy to think of that way. We have a compiler. We have a language spec or something. So that's a language. That's the easy part, right? It's all about community. It's about working together, learning from each other, finding out something exciting, sharing that excitement, making something fun for your friends or your family, or doing something at work that you're really excited about because it's going to make things easier. And I think that's really what Elm is all about. And so I'm excited for the rest of the talks today because I think we're going to see that kind of sort of community fun and excitement of learning. And I hope we'll see that for many years to come. So thanks.